A cabin sealed since 1948 wasn't what frightened her. It was the moment her dog refused the door. 3 months after burying her husband, 68-year-old Evelyn Harper drove into the pine forests of East Texas to inspect land she had unexpectedly inherited. She planned to sell it and leave, but hidden deep among the trees stood an abandoned cabin wrapped in vines, untouched for generations. And when her loyal German shepherd suddenly stopped, lowered his ears, and refused to take another step toward the front door, Evelyn realized this place was holding something far older than dust and decay. If your dog reacted like that to one specific door, would you walk closer or turn around? 3 months after her husband's funeral, Evelyn Harper found herself driving east beneath a sky the color of faded denim. The highway stretched ahead in long, empty lines. Pine forests thickened on both sides of the road. The farther she traveled from Fort Worth, the quieter the world seemed to become. Ranger sat in the back seat of her aging SUV. The German shepherd had barely moved during the 4-hour drive. Every so often, Evelyn glanced at him in the rear-view mirror. He would be looking back at her, always watching, always making sure she was there. The habit had started after Robert died. The dog seemed to understand that something had changed. Maybe not the details, but the absence. Dogs understood absence, sometimes better than people did. Evelyn tightened her grip on the steering wheel. The wedding ring was gone now. She still noticed its absence every day. 42 years of marriage had left countless small routines behind. Reaching toward the passenger seat to share a comment. Hearing someone clear their throat while reading the newspaper. Arguing about which route was faster. All those ordinary things vanished without warning. The silence afterward had been the hardest part. When the attorney called about the inheritance, she almost ignored it. An aunt named Clara Harper had passed away. Evelyn barely remembered her. She had met the woman only a handful of times as a child. Yet somehow Clara had left her 80 acres of East Texas land, a farmhouse, several outbuildings, and everything on the property. The arrangement made little sense. At first, Evelyn intended to decline it. Then she changed her mind. The house in Fort Worth felt too full of memories, too many empty chairs, too many quiet evenings. So she decided to see the property herself before selling it. A simple task: drive out, inspect the land, handle the paperwork, move on. That had been the plan. The GPS eventually instructed her to turn onto a narrow county road. The pavement ended a few miles later. Dust rose behind the SUV as she followed a winding gravel lane through towering pines. Sunlight filtered through the branches in scattered patches. The woods felt older here, untouched, the kind of place where time moved differently. Finally, the trees opened. A farmhouse appeared, small, weathered, still standing. The white paint had faded to a soft gray. The porch sagged slightly on one side. Tall grass swayed around the foundation. But the place wasn't abandoned. Not entirely. Someone had maintained it enough to keep it alive. Evelyn parked and stepped outside. Heat wrapped around her immediately, humid, heavy. The scent of pine sap drifted through the air. Somewhere in the distance, cicadas buzzed endlessly. Ranger jumped down from the SUV. His paws hit the dirt with a familiar thump. For the first time all day, his tail wagged. "Well," Evelyn said softly, "what do you think?" The dog looked around, sniffed the breeze, then trotted toward the porch. Watching him brought the first genuine smile she'd felt in weeks. The farmhouse wasn't much, but it felt peaceful. Maybe that was enough. For the next few hours, Evelyn walked through the property. She checked fences, inspected old sheds, looked over a neglected vegetable garden. Most of the land had returned to nature. Wildflowers pushed through broken boards, blackberry bushes tangled along fence lines. Young pine saplings grew where fields had once existed. Everywhere she looked, she found signs of time passing quietly. The farther she wandered, the more isolated the property felt. The woods seemed endless. As afternoon settled in, Evelyn unfolded an old survey map she had found in the farmhouse kitchen. Most of the markings were faded. One symbol near the northern edge of the property caught her attention. A small square, labeled simply, cabin. She frowned. The realtor had never mentioned a cabin. Curious, she folded the map and started walking. Ranger followed immediately. The path was difficult to find. Years of growth had nearly swallowed it. Branches brushed against Evelyn's shoulders. Dead leaves crunched beneath her boots. The deeper they traveled into the trees, the cooler the air became. The sunlight grew thinner, filtered through layers of pine needles overhead. At first she wondered if the cabin was gone. Then she saw it barely. A dark shape hidden among vines, half consumed by the forest. Evelyn stopped. The cabin stood perhaps 50 yards ahead. Small, weather-beaten, almost invisible beneath decades of overgrowth. Thick ivy crawled across the walls. Moss covered sections of the roof. Several windows had been boarded shut. Not recently, a long time ago. Something about the structure felt strange. Not frightening exactly, just forgotten, as if the woods had spent years trying to erase it. Evelyn slowly approached. Ranger walked beside her, calm, relaxed. Then everything changed. The dog stopped, instantly, no warning. 1 second he was moving forward. The next he stood frozen. Evelyn took another step before realizing he was no longer beside her. She turned. Ranger remained several yards back. His body had gone rigid, his ears lowered, not aggressively, not fearfully, something else, something uncertain. Evelyn frowned. Ranger? The dog didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the cabin. More specifically, the front door. A strange chill crawled across her skin despite the heat. She walked back toward him. It's okay. Ranger glanced at her briefly, then looked toward the door again. His tail hung low, not tucked, just lowered. The way it did when something didn't feel right. Evelyn followed his gaze. The front porch sagged beneath layers of pine needles. A rusted chain stretched across the entrance. Something hung from it. A sign. She stepped closer. The metal groaned softly in the breeze. Years of rain had nearly erased the lettering, but enough remained. Evelyn brushed away dirt and moss with her fingertips. Then she read the words. Her breath caught. Sealed by Family Order 1948. She stared at the sign. 1948. More than 75 years ago. Who sealed a cabin for that long, and why? The questions arrived immediately. Yet none of them disturbed her as much as what happened next. She stepped toward the porch. Ranger let out a low sound. Not a bark, not a growl, a warning, soft, uneasy. The kind he made when approaching unstable ground during hikes. Evelyn stopped. The dog remained exactly where he was, watching, waiting. His eyes never left the door. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The woods had gone strangely quiet. Even the cicadas seemed distant now. A breeze stirred through the pines overhead. The cabin stood motionless beneath its blanket of vines. The sealed sign creaked gently against the chain. Evelyn looked from the sign to the doorway, then back to Ranger. The German Shepherd had crossed collapsed bridges, climbed rocky trails, fought her through thunderstorms. She had never seen him react like this. Not once. Not to a building, not to a place, not to anything, and somehow that bothered her more than the cabin itself. The sun was beginning to sink behind the trees. Long shadows stretched across the forest floor. Evelyn took one final look at the sealed door. Then she turned away. Come on, boy. Ranger didn't hesitate. The moment she walked away from the cabin, he followed. But as they disappeared into the trees, Evelyn glanced over her shoulder one last time. The cabin remained hidden among the pines, silent, waiting. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she had the uncomfortable feeling that whatever had been sealed away in 1948 had never truly been forgotten. The walk back to the farmhouse felt longer than it had earlier that afternoon. The sun was sinking behind the pine trees now, casting long shadows across the property. The golden light that had seemed welcoming a few hours ago suddenly felt different, dimmer somehow. Evelyn told herself she was being foolish. It was an old cabin, nothing more. Old buildings attracted stories. Every small town had them. Every family had them. The rational part of her mind knew that. Still, she found herself glancing toward the tree line as she crossed the yard. The cabin was hidden from view now. Yet she couldn't stop thinking about it, or about Ranger. The Joffrins stayed unusually close that evening. Normally, when they arrived somewhere new, he spent hours exploring every corner, every scent, every fence line. Not tonight. Tonight he remained within a few feet of her, following her from room to room, watching, as if waiting for something. By the time darkness settled over the property, a humid stillness had filled the air. Evelyn heated a can of soup on the stove and carried the bowl to the kitchen table. The farmhouse creaked softly around her, old wood adjusting to cooler temperatures, wind brushing against weathered siding. Nothing unusual. Yet the silence felt heavier than before. Across the room, Ranger lay near the back door. His head rested on his paws. His eyes remained open. Listening after dinner, Evelyn unpacked a few more boxes. Most contained things she had brought from Fort Worth: clothes, books, photographs. At one point, she found an old picture of Robert standing beside a fishing boat, grinning beneath a battered baseball cap. She paused. The familiar ache returned. It always did. Some days it arrived quietly. Other days it hit without warning. 3 months wasn't long. Not after 42 years. She gently placed the photograph on a shelf near the living room window. Then she noticed Ranger. The dog was no longer lying down. He stood motionless near the glass, looking outside. Not barking, not growling, just staring. Evelyn walked over. "What is it, boy?" Ranger's ears twitched. His eyes remained fixed on the darkness beyond the yard, the woods, the same direction as the cabin. For several seconds, neither moved. Then the dog slowly walked away. He circled the room, returned to the window, looked out again. The behavior repeated itself 3 times before midnight. By then, Evelyn had stopped pretending it wasn't strange. When she finally went to bed, Ranger refused his usual place beside it. Instead, he settled near the bedroom doorway, where he could see both her and the hallway. Twice during the night, she woke to the sound of his nails clicking softly against the hardwood floor. Each time, she found him standing alert, watching, listening toward the woods. The next morning arrived gray and overcast. Clouds hung low above the pine trees. The air smelled faintly of rain. Evelyn poured coffee into a travel mug and decided she needed answers. Maybe not about the cabin itself, at least not yet, but about the people who lived around it. Someone in town had to know something. A 20-minute drive brought her to a small community she had passed through the day before. The town looked like dozens of East Texas towns she'd seen over the years. One main street, a hardware store, a feed supply shop, a church, a diner with faded red lettering painted above the entrance. The diner seemed as good a place as any to start. A bell jingled when she opened the door. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee greeted her immediately. Several locals sat in booths beneath old photographs of cattle ranches and county fairs. Conversations drifted through the room. Weather, fishing, local sports, ordinary things. Evelyn found a seat near the counter. A waitress appeared moments later. She looked to be in her late 70s. Silver hair, kind eyes, a name tag that read Mabel. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please." Mabel filled a mug. "You passing through?" "Actually, I inherited property outside town." Mabel nodded. "That happens now and then. My aunt owned 80 acres north of here." The waitress paused slightly. "What was her name?" "Clara Harper." Something flickered across the woman's face. Recognition. Gone almost immediately. "Well, I'll be. You knew her?" "A little." Mabel set down the coffee pot. "Haven't heard that name in years." Evelyn hesitated, then decided to ask. "There's an old cabin on the property." The effect was immediate, not dramatic, subtle, but unmistakable. A conversation stopped somewhere behind her. A fork paused halfway to someone's mouth. The room seemed to quiet for a moment. Then normal chatter resumed. Almost too quickly, Evelyn noticed. So did Mabel. The older woman's eyes drifted toward the window, then back toward Evelyn. "The cabin still standing?" she asked quietly. "I found it yesterday." Mabel studied her face. "Did you go inside?" "No." The waitress nodded once, as though she had expected that answer. "Why not?" Evelyn hesitated, then smiled faintly. "My dog wouldn't let me." For the first time, Mabel's expression changed completely. The warmth disappeared, not replaced by fear. Something closer to concern. "What kind of dog?" "A German shepherd." The older woman leaned slightly closer, a strange seriousness entering her voice. "Did he stop at the door?" Evelyn stared. "How did you know that?" Mabel didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked across the diner toward the windows, toward the distant pine-covered hills beyond town. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. "Did he refuse the porch?" "Yes." "Wouldn't cross it?" "No." The waitress exhaled slowly, almost as if confirming something. Evelyn felt a chill despite the warmth of the diner. "What does that mean?" Mabel looked down at the coffee pot in her hands. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she shook her head. "I can't help you there. You obviously know something." "No." The answer came too quickly, too firmly. "I know stories." "What stories?" Mabel offered a sad smile. "The kind people stop telling after enough years pass." Evelyn waited, but the waitress simply straightened. Conversation over, or so it seemed. She turned and began walking away, then stopped. Without looking back, she spoke one final sentence. "So your dog noticed it too." The words hung in the air. Then she disappeared through a swinging kitchen door. Evelyn sat frozen. The coffee had gone cold. Across the diner, several locals avoided making eye contact. One man paid his bill and left. Another suddenly found great interest in reading a newspaper. Nobody approached her. Nobody volunteered information. It was as if she had accidentally touched a subject everyone understood, but nobody wished to discuss. An hour later, she drove back toward the property. Questions filled her mind, more questions than answers. The road wound through endless rows of pine trees. Rain began falling lightly against the windshield. By the time she reached the farmhouse, the sky had darkened considerably. Ranger met her at the door. His tail wagged once. Then he immediately looked past her toward the woods, toward the hidden cabin. That evening, the rain stopped. Mist drifted among the trees. The property felt quieter than ever. After dinner, Evelyn sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Ranger rested beside her. The forest stood dark beyond the yard, silent. Then suddenly the dog lifted his head, his ears rotated forward. Every muscle in his body tightened. Evelyn followed his gaze. Nothing. Only darkness. Only trees. Yet Ranger rose to his feet. Slowly, deliberately, he walked to the edge of the porch and stared toward the direction of the cabin. A low rumble emerged from deep in his chest. Not aggressive, not threatening. Uneasy, concerned, as if he sensed something she couldn't. The sound lasted only a few seconds. Then he fell silent again. The woods offered no explanation, no movement, no noise, nothing. Yet as darkness settled fully over the property, Evelyn found herself remembering Mabel's question. Did he stop at the door? Not the cabin, not the woods, the door. And for the first time since arriving in East Texas, Evelyn began to wonder whether Ranger's behavior wasn't fear at all. Maybe he was trying to tell her something. Something about that door. Something nobody else wanted to discuss. The thought stayed with Evelyn long after she went inside. That night, sleep came in fragments. She would drift off for an hour, then wake to the sound of the farmhouse settling around her. Old boards creaking, pipes ticking softly in the walls. Each time she opened her eyes, Ranger was awake, not pacing, not barking, just watching. The bedroom window faced north, toward the woods, toward the hidden cabin. Shortly before dawn, Evelyn finally gave up on sleep. She pulled on a sweater and made coffee. Outside, a thin fog clung to the fields. The pine trees emerged from the mist like dark silhouettes. Ranger followed her onto the porch. The dog seemed calmer than the night before, but his attention still drifted toward the forest. Every few minutes, Evelyn sat quietly with her coffee. The logical thing would be to call a realtor, list the property, sell everything, return to Fort Worth. That had been the plan from the beginning. Yet the plan no longer felt simple. Not after the cabin, not after Mabel's reaction, not after seeing Ranger stop dead in his tracks at the porch. A breeze moved through the trees. The farmhouse roof creaked softly. Evelyn looked up, then frowned. She remembered something. When she first toured the house, she had barely looked at the attic. There had been too much else to inspect. Too many rooms, too much dust. The thought arrived unexpectedly. If Aunt Clara had lived here for decades, perhaps she had left records somewhere. Old papers, photographs, something, anything. By mid-morning, she found herself standing beneath the attic hatch in the hallway. A folding ladder rattled as she pulled it down. Dust immediately drifted into the air. Ranger sat below, watching. "You stay down here," she told him. The dog tilted his head. Evelyn smiled despite herself. Then she climbed. The attic smelled of aged wood, insulation, and decades of forgotten summers. The space stretched farther than she expected. Sunlight slipped through tiny vents near the roofline. Cardboard boxes sat in rows. Old furniture rested beneath white sheets. A rocking chair occupied one corner. The entire place felt frozen in time. Evelyn moved carefully. Dust coated everything. Several boxes contained holiday decorations. Others held dishes and books. Nothing unusual, nothing mysterious. After nearly an hour, she was ready to quit. She wiped sweat from her forehead and glanced around one last time. That was when she noticed something odd. One of the support beams looked slightly different. Not newer, just cleaner, as if someone had touched it more recently than the surrounding wood. Curious, she stepped closer. The beam ran along the far wall beneath the roofline. At first, she saw nothing. Then her fingers brushed against paper. Her pulse quickened. Wedged deep inside a narrow gap was an envelope. It had been deliberately hidden, not lost, not forgotten. Hidden carefully. Evelyn slowly pulled it free. Dust fell onto her sleeves. The envelope itself was yellowed with age. Across the front, written in faded blue ink, were 3 words. For Evelyn Harper, she stared. For a moment, she simply stood there. The attic seemed strangely quiet. Her name, not a family name, not a generic label. Her name. Someone had expected her to find this. A shiver ran through her. Carefully, she opened the flap. Several items slid into her hands. Old photographs, a folded map, and a single handwritten note. The handwriting was neat, despite its age. She recognized the signature immediately. Clara Harper, her aunt. Evelyn sat on an old trunk nearby. For a long moment, she simply looked at the paper. The woman who wrote it had been gone for months. The message had waited here all this time. Finally, she unfolded it. The note contained only one sentence. "Before you decide what to do with this land, trust the dog, nothing else. No is explanation, no greeting, no signature beyond Clara's name at the bottom. Just that. Trust the dog." Evelyn read it again and again. A dozen questions immediately crowded her mind. Why hide this? Why leave it for her? Why mention Ranger? Most importantly, how could Clara possibly know about a dog she had never met? Ranger was only 5 years old. Clara had lived alone for decades. The two had never crossed paths. It made no sense. She set the note aside and examined the remaining contents. The photographs appeared older, much older. Most were black and white. Several showed the farmhouse during earlier decades. Others showed family members she barely recognized. Men in work clothes. Women standing beside vehicles from another era. Children gathered beneath enormous pine trees. Then she found one that made her pause. The cabin. The same cabin hidden in the woods. The image had been taken long before vines consumed the walls. Long before the windows were boarded. The structure appeared clean, maintained, alive. Someone had even planted flowers near the porch. Evelyn studied the picture closely. The front door stood visible in the photograph. Plain, ordinary, nothing unusual. Yet she found herself staring at it. Thinking about Ranger, thinking about Mabel, thinking about the sealed sign. She carefully unfolded the map next. It showed the 80-acre property. Not professionally drawn, handmade. Certain locations had been marked with small circles. The farmhouse, the creek, the northern tree line, and the cabin. The cabin's circle had been darkened repeatedly, as if someone wanted to make absolutely certain it wouldn't be overlooked. No instructions accompanied the map. No explanations. Only markings. Only clues. The entire package felt unfinished, like the first page of a much larger story. A floorboard creaked below. Evelyn glanced toward the attic opening. Ranger, the dog, was standing at the bottom of the ladder, watching her, waiting, almost as if he knew she had found something important. She laughed softly. "Apparently everybody wants me to trust you." His ears perked. The German shepherd's tail thumped once against the floor. An hour later, Evelyn spread everything across the kitchen table. The note, the photographs, the map. Sunlight streamed through the windows as she examined each item again. The message remained the most unsettling part. Trust the dog. Simple words, yet impossible to ignore, especially now. Because Ranger had noticed the cabin first. Ranger had reacted to the door. Ranger had sensed something nobody would explain, and somehow Clara had anticipated it. Outside, clouds drifted across the afternoon sky. The property seemed peaceful again. Ordinary. Yet the envelope had changed something. Before, the cabin had been a curiosity, a strange old building. Now it felt different, intentional. Someone had wanted Evelyn to find it. Someone had wanted her to keep looking. Across the room, Ranger rose from his bed. He walked to the back door, then glanced at her, waiting, not demanding, not excited, simply waiting, the way he did before a walk. Evelyn looked at the map again. Her eyes settled on the dark circle around the cabin. Then she looked at the dog. For the first time since arriving in East Texas, she no longer felt tempted to avoid the mystery. She wanted answers. And if Aunt Clara's final message meant anything at all, the answers weren't waiting in town. They were somewhere on the property, somewhere near that cabin. Somewhere Ranger had already noticed, long before she had. The thought stayed with Evelyn throughout the afternoon. The note remained on the kitchen table beside the old photographs and the hand-drawn map. Every time she walked past, her eyes drifted back to the same sentence. Trust the dog. Simple words. Yet they carried more weight now than when she first discovered them. Outside, clouds gathered over the pine forest. The air felt heavier than usual. Rain threatened but never arrived. By late afternoon, Evelyn folded the map and slipped it into her jacket pocket. She wasn't entirely sure what she intended to find. Only that, sitting inside the farmhouse wasn't helping. Ranger rose immediately when she reached for her boots. His ears lifted. His tail gave a slow wag. For the first time in days, he seemed eager. "All right," Evelyn said. "Let's go see what you've been trying to tell me." The path to the cabin felt more familiar now, less frightening. Still, an uneasy feeling lingered beneath her curiosity. The pine woods seemed unusually quiet. No birds, no squirrels, only the soft crunch of fallen needles beneath their feet. As the cabin emerged between the trees, Ranger's pace slowed. Evelyn noticed immediately the same reaction, the same caution, the same fixed attention toward the front porch. The dog stopped several yards away, exactly where he had stopped before. His body remained relaxed, not fearful, not aggressive, just unwilling to move closer. Evelyn studied him carefully. This time she paid attention to every detail. His gaze never wandered. It stayed focused on the porch area, more specifically, the front doorway. Not the windows, not the roof, not the surrounding woods, the doorway. She followed his line of sight. The weathered entrance appeared unchanged. The rusted chain still stretched across the porch. The faded sign still hung from it, Nothing seemed unusual, yet Ranger refused to approach. Evelyn took several cautious steps forward. The dog remained where he was, watching. She stopped near the porch and turned back. "Come on." Ranger didn't move. The German Shepherd simply sat down. A clear refusal. Evelyn sighed. Then something occurred to her. What if she had been asking the wrong question? What if Ranger wasn't trying to keep her away? What if he was trying to direct her attention somewhere specific? She stepped away from the porch. Immediately Ranger stood. His ears relaxed slightly. Interesting. Evelyn moved around the side of the cabin. The dog followed. No hesitation, no resistance. Together they circled the structure slowly. The cabin looked even older up close. Vines wrapped around support posts. Moss-covered sections of the foundation. Years of neglect had blended the building into the forest itself. As they reached the rear of the cabin, Ranger suddenly stopped. His nose lifted. He sniffed the air, then sniffed again. Evelyn watched. The change in his behavior was immediate, focused, intentional. The dog lowered his head and moved toward the back foundation. His pace quickened. He examined a narrow section of ground beneath one corner of the structure. Then he began pawing at the dirt, not playfully, not randomly, purposefully. Evelyn frowned. "Ranger?" The dog continued digging. Pine needles scattered behind him. Loose soil flew into the air. Within seconds, a shallow hole had formed. Then Ranger stopped. He stepped back and looked directly at Evelyn, waiting. The same way he waited when he found something during hiking trips. The same way he alerted her to a snake once hidden beside a trail. Evelyn knelt beside the hole. At first she saw nothing. Just roots, dirt, small rocks. Then sunlight caught something beneath the soil. Metal. Her pulse quickened. Carefully, she brushed away more dirt with her hands. The object slowly emerged. A small, rusted box, about the size of a dictionary. Its corners were corroded, its surface stained by decades underground. For a moment, Evelyn simply stared. The forest seemed strangely still around her. The box hadn't been exposed accidentally. Someone had buried it, deliberately, near the cabin, near the foundation, near whatever mystery had kept the building sealed since 1948. "Good boy," she whispered. Ranger sat beside her, watching quietly. Evelyn carried the box back to the farmhouse. Her heart beat faster the entire walk home. Rain finally began falling as they reached the porch. A steady drizzle tapped against the roof. Inside, she spread newspapers across the kitchen table. The metal box sat in the center, silent, waiting. The rusted latch resisted at first. Years underground had fused parts of the mechanism together. Eventually, after careful effort with a screwdriver from the kitchen drawer, the seal broke, the lid creaked open, a stale odor drifted out. Old paper, dust, time. Inside were several bundles wrapped in oilcloth. Evelyn carefully unfolded the first package. Letters, dozens of them, handwritten, yellowed with age. The ink had faded but remained readable. She set them aside for the moment. Beneath the letters lay folded land records, property maps, legal documents, tax papers, most dated between the mid-1940s and early 1950s. Confusing, yet obviously important enough for someone to hide. Then she reached the bottom of the box and found the photograph. The moment she lifted it, something felt wrong, not because of what it showed, because of what it didn't. The photograph had been taken in front of the cabin. The same cabin. Only newer, cleaner. Several people stood together on the porch. Men, women, a young boy. Everyone appeared ordinary, smiling, relaxed, except for one detail. One face had been violently scratched away. Not faded, not damaged by time. Removed deliberately. The scratches cut deep into the paper. Someone had wanted that person erased. Evelyn stared. A strange chill moved through her. Why destroy only one face? Why preserve the rest? She turned the photograph over. A date had been written on the back. October 1948. Nothing else, no names, no explanation. Only the date. Ranger rested beneath the table. His eyes followed her movements. The dog seemed unusually calm now. as though finding the box had relieved some tension. Evelyn picked up the letters. Most appeared to be personal correspondence. Several mentioned land ownership disputes. Others referenced meetings and legal matters she didn't yet understand. Then one sentence caught her attention. The letter was dated November 1948. The handwriting belonged to someone named Margaret Ellis. Evelyn read the line twice, then a third time. "I still pray someone learns what happened to Daniel." Her breath caught. Daniel. No last name. No explanation. Just a name, she continued reading. Another letter mentioned it, then another. Always indirectly, always carefully, as if the writers feared saying too much. Daniel hasn't returned. Nobody believes the official story. The family deserves answers. If Daniel was alive, he would have contacted someone. Evelyn slowly lowered the paper. The room suddenly felt smaller. The mystery had shifted. Until now, everything revolved around the cabin. The sealed door, the hidden note, the strange reactions. Now there was someone else. A missing person. Someone important enough to appear repeatedly in private letters. Someone connected to the property. Someone connected to 1948. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Rain streaked across the kitchen windows. Ranger lifted his head briefly, then settled again. Evelyn looked back at the scratch photograph. Her eyes drifted toward the missing face, the damaged image, the deliberate destruction. An uncomfortable possibility formed in her mind. Was that Daniel? Had someone tried to erase him? Outside, darkness settled over the pine country. Inside the farmhouse, Evelyn sat alone with the buried secrets of people long gone. The cabin was no longer just an abandoned building hidden in the woods. Now it felt like the center of a much larger story. A story someone had spent decades trying to hide. And thanks to a German shepherd who refused to ignore what he sensed beneath the porch, Evelyn had just uncovered the first real piece of it. She carefully gathered the letters and photographs. Tomorrow she would read every page, every record, every name, because somewhere inside that rusted box was the answer to a question she hadn't known existed until now. Who was Daniel? And why had somebody worked so hard to make him disappear? The questions followed Evelyn through the night. Rain continued, tapping softly against the farmhouse roof long after midnight. The old letters remained spread across the kitchen table beneath a reading lamp. Several times she tried going to bed. Several times she found herself returning to the documents. By 2 a.m, she had learned only fragments. A missing man, concerned neighbors, rumors, fear, nothing complete, nothing clear. Yet one thing stood out. Nobody ever wrote about Daniel in the past tense. Not at first. The earliest letters spoke of searching for him, waiting for him, expecting him to come home. Something about that bothered her. It didn't sound like people discussing a man who had died. It sounded like people discussing someone who had vanished. There was a difference, a very important difference. The next morning arrived bright and clear. The storm had washed the air clean. Sunlight sparkled on wet grass. Birds returned to the pine trees. For the first time in days, the property felt almost cheerful. Ranger sat beside the porch steps while Evelyn loaded folders and photographs into a canvas tote bag. The German shepherd watched every movement carefully. "You've gotten me into quite a mess," she told him. His tail thumped against the wooden floor. Evelyn smiled, then headed for town. The county archives occupied a brick building near the courthouse square. The structure looked unchanged since the 1950s. Tall windows, faded stone steps, rows of old records stored behind heavy wooden doors. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and dust. The familiar scent immediately reminded Evelyn of her years as a librarian. For the first time since arriving in East Texas, she felt completely comfortable. The front desk was unattended. A bell sat beside a sign requesting visitors ring for assistance. Evelyn tapped it lightly. A moment later, footsteps echoed somewhere deeper in the building. An older man appeared carrying a stack of books. Tall, lean, white hair, wire-rim glasses. He looked to be in his 70s. His expression suggested someone who preferred books over people. "Can I help you?" he asked. Evelyn introduced herself. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "Harper?" "Yes." "The property north of town?" She nodded. News traveled fast around here. The man set his books down. "Jonah Reeves." He extended a hand. "I volunteer here a few days a week." His handshake was firm. Teacher hands. Evelyn recognized them immediately. "You were an educator." Jonah smiled. "History teacher. 37 years. That explained everything." She found herself liking him almost immediately. Unlike others she'd encountered, Jonah didn't seem uncomfortable discussing the property. In fact, he appeared curious. Very curious. "What are you looking for?" he asked. Evelyn hesitated, then decided honesty would be simpler. "I found some old documents buried near a cabin on my land." Jonah's eyebrows rose. "A cabin?" "The one sealed in 1948. The reaction was subtle, but it was there. A brief silence, a thoughtful expression. Recognition. Not fear, not avoidance. Recognition. "You found something connected to that place?" Evelyn removed the photograph from her bag, the one with the scratched-out face. Jonah adjusted his glasses and studied it. His expression changed almost immediately. "Well," he said quietly, "I'll be damned." "What?" He pointed toward the damaged section. "That's probably Daniel." The room seemed to grow still. Evelyn pulled out a chair, slowly sat down. "You know who he was?" Jonah remained silent for several seconds, then nodded. "Only pieces. Tell me." The retired teacher walked toward a nearby filing cabinet. He opened a drawer and removed several folders. Dust drifted into the sunlight. "I've spent years researching local history," he said. "Most stories disappear after enough time passes." He placed the folders on the table, but some leave traces. Together they began sorting through old records, newspaper clippings, property maps, court filings, tax assessments, dozens of small fragments. At first, the information seemed disconnected. Then patterns began emerging. One name appeared repeatedly. Daniel Cross. Born 1925, ranch hand, occasional farm laborer, known throughout the county. No criminal history, no record of trouble, nothing unusual. Until 1948. That's when everything changed. Jonah found an article dated November 1948. The headline immediately caught Evelyn's attention. "Local worker wanted." For questioning below it appeared a grainy photograph. Daniel, young, dark-haired, perhaps 23 years old. His expression seemed serious but approachable. An ordinary man. Exactly the kind of person who might disappear without becoming famous or remembered. Evelyn studied the photograph. Questioning about what? Jonah slid another article across the table. Alleged theft. The accusation involved property documents, land ownership records, several missing files. Nothing violent, nothing dramatic. Yet somehow the situation escalated quickly, too quickly. Evelyn noticed it immediately. The timeline felt wrong. Within weeks of the accusation, Daniel disappeared. Within months, the investigation ended. Case closed, no arrest, no trial, no body, no explanation, just gone. "That doesn't make sense," she said. Jonah nodded. "Exactly." He opened another folder. Inside were handwritten notes collected over decades, personal interviews, family recollections, oral histories. Many contradicted the official story. One farmer claimed Daniel was honest. Another described him as dependable. Several insisted he would never steal anything. One statement appeared repeatedly. "Daniel knew something." Evelyn looked up. "What does that mean?" Nobody ever agreed on the details. Jonah leaned back. But according to local rumors, he found information that embarrassed certain people. "What people?" The retired teacher hesitated, then pointed toward several names appearing throughout county records. Families, old landowners, businessmen, influential figures. Some descendants still lived in town, owned businesses, held local offices, served on community boards. The same surnames kept appearing, again and again. Evelyn felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Are you saying Daniel disappeared because of them? I'm saying I don't know. Jonah folded his hands. But I know something else. What? The moment people stop asking questions about history, history becomes whatever the powerful decide it was. The words lingered. Neither spoke for a moment. Outside, the courthouse clock struck noon. A distant bell echoed through town. Jonah eventually stood. There may be more records downstairs. He disappeared into the storage area. Evelyn remained seated. The photograph lay before her. Daniel Cross. A face scratched from another photograph. A name buried in letters. A man erased from local memory. Yet someone had worked very hard to preserve traces of him. Someone buried documents. Someone hid photographs. Someone sealed a cabin. And someone left instructions telling Evelyn to trust her dog. The deeper she looked, the less accidental everything seemed. An hour later, she left the archives carrying copies of records Jonah helped locate. The afternoon sun hung high above the courthouse square. People moved along sidewalks. Cars passed. Life continued normally. Yet Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she was now seeing the town differently. As she walked toward her vehicle, two older men sitting outside a barbershop watched her. Not unusual. Small towns noticed newcomers. Still, she couldn't help noticing how their conversations stopped when she passed. At a gas station, another woman glanced toward the folders beneath Evelyn's arm, then quickly looked away. Maybe it meant nothing, maybe not. By the time she reached the farmhouse, an uncomfortable realization had settled in. People remembered Daniel, not openly, not publicly, but they remembered, and some of them clearly preferred that certain questions remain unanswered. Ranger greeted her at the porch. The German shepherd immediately sniffed the folders she carried. His tail wagged once. Then he looked toward the distant woods, toward the hidden cabin, toward the sealed door. Evelyn followed his gaze. The cabin stood invisible from the house, yet somehow it felt closer now. The mystery was no longer about an abandoned building. Now it had a face, a name, a history, Daniel Cross. And the more she learned about him, the more she suspected his disappearance wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. For the next 2 days, Evelyn barely left the property. The folders Jonah Reeves had helped her uncover occupied nearly every inch of the kitchen table. Newspaper clippings sat beside tax records. Handwritten notes rested beside old survey maps. Each document seemed to answer one question while creating 3 more. Daniel Cross had been accused of stealing land records, yet nobody had ever explained why. No evidence appeared in any of the files. No witness statements, no trial, no conviction, just accusations. Then silence. The deeper Evelyn looked, the stranger it felt. Ranger spent most of those days stretched out near the back door. Calm, patient, occasionally lifting his head whenever she muttered something aloud while reading. Late on the 3rd afternoon, Evelyn found herself staring at the photograph from the buried box once again. The one taken in front of the cabin. The one with the scratched-out face. Her eyes drifted toward the doorway in the image, then toward the kitchen window, toward the distant woods. A memory surfaced, Mabel's voice. Did he stop at the door? Not the cabin. The door. Jonah had spent hours discussing Daniel. The townspeople reacted to Daniel's name. But Ranger had never cared about Daniel. Ranger cared about the door. A slow realization began forming. She had spent days investigating the people connected to the mystery. Maybe it was time to investigate the mystery itself. An hour later, she found herself walking through the pine woods again. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees in long golden shafts. The air smelled of warm earth and pine resin. Somewhere overhead, a woodpecker hammered against bark. Ranger moved quietly beside her. Relaxed at first, comfortable. Then the cabin came into view. Immediately his pace changed. Not fear, not panic, awareness. The same behavior Evelyn had noticed before. The same focus, the same attention directed toward a single point. The front entrance. The The dog stopped, exactly where he always stopped. Several yards from the porch, his ears lowered slightly, his gaze locked onto the doorway. Evelyn didn't approach immediately. Instead, she watched him. Really watched him. The German shepherd wasn't looking at the cabin walls. He wasn't studying the roof. He wasn't paying attention to the windows. Only the doorway. Only the threshold. The distinction suddenly seemed important. Very important. She slowly walked toward the porch. Ranger remained behind, watching, waiting. The rusted chain still stretched across the entrance. The faded sign swayed gently in the breeze. Sealed by Family Order 1948, Evelyn stepped onto the first porch board. It groaned beneath her weight. Nothing happened. No strange sounds. No hidden mechanisms. No dramatic discoveries. Just an old cabin. Yet Ranger still refused to move. She crouched near the doorway. The wood was heavily weathered. Decades of rain and summer heat had left deep cracks across the frame. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then she noticed something odd. One section of the threshold appeared slightly different from the surrounding wood. Not newer, not obvious. Just different. The grain ran at a slightly different angle. The nails were spaced differently, as if one piece had been installed separately. Her pulse quickened. Carefully, she brushed away layers of dirt and pine needles. The more she cleaned, the stranger it looked. A narrow seam appeared beneath the weathered surface, almost invisible, hidden beneath decades of wear. Evelyn leaned closer. Ranger let out a low whine from behind her. Not a warning, a nervous sound, the kind he made when waiting for her to notice something. "I see it," she whispered. The seam extended along part of the threshold, far too straight to be natural, far too deliberate. She returned to the farmhouse and retrieved several tools. A flashlight, a screwdriver, a small pry bar. By the time she returned, clouds had begun gathering overhead. The woods felt darker, more enclosed. Ranger followed, but again stopped short of the porch. His eyes never left her. Evelyn knelt beside the doorway, carefully inserted the screwdriver into the seam. Nothing. She tried another section. Still nothing. Then, near the left side of the threshold, she felt movement. A slight shift, barely noticeable. Her heartbeat quickened. She applied gentle pressure. The hidden section moved, only a fraction of an inch, but it moved. "Oh my God." The words escaped before she realized she had spoken them. The compartment wasn't part of the cabin. It was built into the doorway itself, exactly where Ranger had been staring since the day they arrived. The hidden panel slowly lifted free. Dust drifted into the air. A stale smell emerged from the darkness beneath. Old paper, old wood, time. Inside rested a long, narrow bundle wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Protected from moisture, protected from decay, protected from discovery. For 75 years, Evelyn carefully lifted it out. Her hands trembled slightly. The bundle felt surprisingly heavy. She carried it onto the porch and slowly unfolded the layers. Inside was a journal. The leather cover had darkened with age. The corners were worn, yet it remained remarkably well preserved. A name appeared on the first page: Thomas Harper. Evelyn frowned. The name sounded familiar. Then she remembered. Her Aunt Clara had once mentioned an older brother, a brother who died young. Thomas. She opened the journal. The first entries were dated 1948. The handwriting belonged to a teenager. 17 years old, according to the birth records she'd found in the farmhouse. A boy writing about daily life, farm chores, school, neighbors, small-town events, normal things. For several pages, nothing unusual appeared. Then the tone changed, abruptly. The entries grew shorter, more serious, more cautious. Names appeared repeatedly: Daniel, several local landowners, meetings, arguments. Things Thomas clearly didn't fully understand. Yet something else stood out. Fear, not panic, not terror, concern. The kind of concern a teenager feels when adults around him begin acting strangely. Evelyn turned another page, and another. The entries became increasingly cryptic. Daniel says they took papers that don't belong to them. Dad says stay out of it. Daniel won't stay quiet. People are angry. A chill moved through her. The journal wasn't a history book. It wasn't written after the fact. This was a witness. Someone recording events as they happened. Someone standing close enough to see pieces of the truth. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The sky darkened further. Ranger remained motionless at the edge of the clearing, watching. The dog seemed calmer now. The tension that had surrounded him for days appeared to be fading. Evelyn looked from the journal to the doorway, then back to Ranger. Suddenly, she understood. The cabin had never been what mattered. The secret wasn't inside. The secret had been hidden in the threshold all along. The doorway. The exact place Ranger refused to cross. The exact place everyone kept mentioning. The exact place nobody wanted to discuss. She opened the journal again. The next pages were filled with increasingly troubling entries, references to missing documents, disputes over property ownership, growing hostility within the community, and Daniel Cross appearing at the center of it all. Whatever had happened in 1948, Thomas Harper had witnessed the beginning. The journal was no longer just another clue. It was a direct connection to the past. A voice speaking across generations. A voice hidden beneath a doorway for 75 years. And as thunder rolled across the East Texas sky, Evelyn realized she was finally standing at the edge of the truth. The cabin was never the secret. The doorway was. And Ranger had known it from the very beginning. The storm arrived shortly after Evelyn returned to the farmhouse. Rain hammered the metal roof. Wind pushed against the windows. Branches scraped softly across the siding. Inside, a single lamp illuminated the kitchen table. The journal lay open before her. Ranger rested nearby. For the first time in days, the German Shepherd seemed completely at ease, as though finding the hidden compartment had resolved something that had bothered him from the moment they arrived. Evelyn poured herself a fresh cup of coffee. Then she turned the page. The entries became darker, more detailed, and far more troubling. Thomas Harper had been only 17 in 1948, young enough to miss important pieces, old enough to notice when adults started lying. His writing reflected that balance perfectly. At first, the journal described small-town life, church socials, school events, harvest schedules. Then Daniel Cross began appearing more frequently, not as a criminal, not as a troublemaker, as a friend, a trusted neighbor, a man Thomas clearly admired. Daniel says something isn't right. That sentence appeared in one entry. A few pages later, Daniel found records that don't match. Then, Mr. Ellison got angry when Daniel asked questions. Evelyn read slowly, carefully. Every page revealed another fragment, another piece of a puzzle hidden for 3/4 of a century. The rain intensified outside. Thomas eventually described what Daniel had discovered. It wasn't theft. It wasn't missing money. It was land ownership records. Entire families had been losing property through transactions they didn't understand. Many of them were poor. Some couldn't afford lawyers. Others could barely read the complicated legal documents placed in front of them. According to the journal, several influential men in the county had quietly taken advantage of that reality. Boundaries were altered, documents disappeared, new paperwork appeared, property changed hands, perfectly legal on paper, yet deeply dishonest in practice. Daniel noticed patterns nobody else noticed, or perhaps patterns nobody else wanted to notice. The further Evelyn read, the heavier her chest felt. These weren't strangers. These were families. People trying to survive. People trusting their neighbors. People slowly losing pieces of their lives without understanding how. A flash of lightning illuminated the kitchen. The thunder followed seconds later. Ranger briefly lifted his head, then settled again. Evelyn continued reading. Thomas described arguments taking place around town. Conversations stopping when Daniel entered a room. Men refusing to speak openly. Church gatherings becoming tense. The journal never named every person involved. But certain surnames appeared repeatedly. The same names Jonah had pointed out at the archives. Families whose descendants still lived in town. Families whose influence had never completely disappeared. One entry stopped Evelyn cold. Dad told Daniel to leave it alone. Daniel said, "If nobody speaks, more families will lose everything." Evelyn stared at the words, then read them again. For several moments she thought about Robert. Her husband had been the kind of man who spoke up when something wasn't right, even when it was inconvenient, even when it cost him. The memory arrived unexpectedly. She smiled sadly, then returned to the journal. The next pages revealed the turning point. A set of land records disappeared. Soon afterward, Daniel was accused of stealing them. The accusation spread quickly, faster than truth usually traveled. Thomas seemed confused by it. His journal reflected that confusion. Nobody can explain why Daniel would steal papers he wanted everyone to see. The sentence struck Evelyn immediately. It made no sense. If Daniel was trying to expose wrongdoing, why would he steal the evidence? The accusation felt backwards, manufactured, convenient, as though someone needed a reason to discredit him. The entries grew shorter after that, more emotional. People stopped talking to Daniel. Some crossed the street when they saw him. Others refused to hire him. Then came the final entry mentioning him directly. Daniel says he has copies hidden somewhere safe. He says the truth won't disappear. After that, the journal changed completely. The next several pages described fear. Not Daniel's fear, Thomas's. The teenager had clearly realized something serious was happening. Several entries mentioned adults warning him to stay quiet. One specifically mentioned Aunt Clara. Clara cried today. She says Daniel isn't coming back. Evelyn lowered the journal. The kitchen suddenly felt very quiet. The storm continued outside, but inside there was only the ticking of an old wall clock. She imagined Clara as a young woman, living through all of this, watching someone disappear, watching people pretend nothing happened, then spending decades carrying that knowledge. The realization hurt more than she expected. Perhaps because she finally understood why Clara had hidden the note, why she had left the property to Evelyn, why she had never simply thrown everything away. Clara hadn't forgotten. She had been waiting for someone willing to finish what others never could. Evelyn turned another page. Near the back of the journal, Thomas wrote about the aftermath. The official story spread quickly. Daniel stole records. Daniel ran away. Daniel abandoned the town. Case closed. Yet Thomas clearly didn't believe it. Neither did Clara. Neither did many others. But belief and proof were different things, and proof had vanished. Or so everyone thought. Until Ranger found the buried box. Until the doorway revealed its secret. Until 75 years later, someone finally started asking questions again. The rain began slowing outside. The storm was moving east. Evelyn closed the journal gently. Her eyes drifted toward the old photograph on the table, the one with the scratched-out face. Daniel Cross. For days he had been a mystery, a name, a rumor, a disappearance. Now he felt real, human, a young man who had seen something wrong and refused to ignore it. A man whose life had been changed because of it, and perhaps not only his life. The families described in the journal remained with her. People who lost land, people who lost security, people who may never have known what truly happened. A deep sadness settled over her, followed quickly by anger. Not loud anger, not dramatic anger, the quieter kind. The kind that arrives when injustice survives because too many people choose silence. Ranger stood and walked over to her chair. Without hesitation, he rested his head gently against her knee. Evelyn stroked the fur behind his ears. The familiar gesture grounded her. Outside, the last of the storm clouds drifted away. Moonlight began appearing through breaks in the darkness. Inside the farmhouse, the pieces of the mystery finally felt connected. Daniel Cross had not been a thief. He had been a threat. Not because he took something, because he discovered something. And somewhere beyond the journal, beyond the buried box, beyond the hidden compartment in the doorway, the full truth was still waiting. Evelyn could feel it, closer now than ever before. And for the first time since arriving in East Texas, she realized the mystery was no longer about finding Daniel. It was about discovering what powerful people had been so desperate to hide. The realization stayed with Evelyn for days. Every morning she sat at the kitchen table before sunrise, coffee steaming beside stacks of records, the journal open, the old letters spread around her like pieces of a map. Outside, East Texas moved at its usual pace, wind through the pines, mockingbirds calling from fence posts, distant tractors somewhere beyond the tree line. But inside the farmhouse, time seemed divided between two worlds, the present and 1948. Ranger rarely left her side. Whenever she moved from room to room, the German shepherd followed. Sometimes he would lie quietly beneath the table while she worked. Other times he would sit by the window, watching the woods. The tension that had once surrounded him had faded. Yet Evelyn sensed he wasn't finished leading her. Not yet. One afternoon she drove back to town carrying another box of copied records. Jonah Reeves was already waiting when she arrived at the archives. The retired teacher looked unusually excited. He greeted her before she reached the desk. "I found something." Evelyn immediately set her bag down. "What is it?" Jonah held up a yellowed ledger book. The cover was cracked with age. Dust coated the edges. This came from an abandoned law office that closed 20 years ago. He carefully opened it. Nobody had cataloged it properly. The pages were filled with property transactions, names, dates, boundaries, sales, transfers. At first it looked like every other record she'd already examined. Then Jonah pointed to several entries. "Look here." Evelyn leaned closer. The names matched families mentioned in Thomas Harper's journal. Families who had allegedly lost land. Families Daniel had tried to help. Yet something was different. Very different. Several properties appeared to change ownership twice within weeks. Others contained conflicting descriptions. Boundary lines didn't match official maps. A few signatures appeared suspiciously similar. Almost copied. Jonah tapped one page. Daniel wasn't imagining things. Evelyn nodded. No, he found something real. For the next several hours they compared records. The pattern became undeniable. Property had been moved through complicated transactions, not always illegally, but often deceptively. Poor families lost acreage. Influential landowners gained it. Over and over, the same names surfaced, the same beneficiaries, the same outcomes. By late afternoon, Evelyn's eyes ached from reading. She pushed back from the table. Even if Daniel discovered this, it still doesn't explain what happened to him. Jonah was quiet for a moment. Then he opened another folder. This might. Inside were census records, tax documents, employment files. Nothing unusual at first. Then Evelyn noticed something. A date. Several years after Daniel supposedly disappeared. She frowned. That can't be right. Jonah adjusted his glasses. That's what I thought. The document listed a man named David Carter. The age matched Daniel. The birthplace matched Daniel. Even the handwriting looked remarkably similar to signatures they'd already seen. Evelyn stared at the page. Her pulse quickened. "You're saying Daniel changed his name?" "I'm saying it's possible." The room suddenly felt smaller. The entire mystery shifted beneath her feet. For weeks she had assumed Daniel died. Everyone had: the town, the letters, the rumors, the journal. All of it pointed toward tragedy. But what if Daniel hadn't been murdered? What if he escaped? The possibility changed everything. That evening, Evelyn returned home, carrying copies of the records. The sun was setting behind the pines. Orange light spilled across the fields. Ranger greeted her at the porch. As usual, he immediately sensed her excitement. The dog trotted beside her as she hurried into the house. For hours she compared signatures, photographs, dates, locations. The more she examined them, the stronger the evidence became. David Carter and Daniel Cross appeared to be the same man. The similarities were impossible to ignore, but the biggest discovery came just before midnight. Hidden inside one of the archived financial records was a series of money transfers. Small amounts, sent anonymously year after year, decade after decade. The recipients shocked her. Several belonged to descendants of the families who lost land in 1948. The payments weren't large, just enough to help, enough to matter, enough to suggest intention. Evelyn sat back in her chair, speechless. Daniel hadn't vanished completely. He had spent years quietly helping the very people he tried to defend. A lump formed in her throat. The image she'd built in her mind suddenly changed. Daniel was no longer simply a victim. He was a survivor, a man forced to leave everything behind, a man who apparently spent the rest of his life carrying responsibility for people he couldn't save. The next morning, she shared everything with Jonah. The retired teacher removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Jonah broke the silence. "Do you realize what this means?" Evelyn nodded slowly. "It means the story everyone believed was wrong, not just wrong." Jonah looked toward the courthouse window, completely backwards. The old narrative had been simple. Daniel stole records. Daniel ran away. Daniel disappeared. End of story. The truth was far more complicated. Daniel discovered corruption. Daniel was accused. Daniel fled, then spent decades helping families from the shadows. The mystery that began with loss suddenly contained something unexpected. Hope. Not complete hope. Not a happy ending, but something better than the darkness everyone assumed. As Evelyn drove home that afternoon, she found herself thinking about Thomas Harper's journal, about Clara, about all the people who spent decades believing Daniel was gone forever. None of them knew. None of them ever learned that he survived. The thought filled her with a strange sadness. Yet there was comfort, too. Somewhere out there, beyond the records and paperwork, Daniel had lived a life. Perhaps not the life he wanted, but a life. The sun hung low over the pine country when she reached the farmhouse. Ranger waited at the edge of the porch. The German shepherd seemed unusually alert. His ears pointed toward the woods behind the cabin. Not toward the doorway this time, toward something deeper, something farther back. Evelyn followed his gaze. The trees stood motionless, quiet, ancient. A gentle breeze stirred their branches. Then Ranger looked back at her, waiting. The same look he had given before the buried lockbox. The same look he had given before the hidden compartment. A look that said he had noticed something again. Evelyn glanced toward the darkening tree line. A feeling settled over her. The mystery wasn't finished, not yet. Daniel's survival explained one part of the story, but another question remained. Perhaps the most important one of all. If Daniel lived long enough to help those families, then where was the final truth he wanted someone to find? And why did it feel as though Ranger already knew where to look? The question lingered in Evelyn's mind through the night. She stood on the farmhouse porch long after sunset, watching darkness settle across the property. The pines became silhouettes. The fields disappeared into shadow. Somewhere beyond the tree line sat the old cabin, silent, waiting, the same way it had waited for 75 years. Ranger lay beside her chair, calm but not asleep. Every so often, the German shepherd would lift his head and glance toward the woods behind the cabin, not toward the doorway, not toward the porch, beyond it, farther back, as if his attention had shifted, as if whatever had drawn him to the doorway was no longer the most important thing. The next morning, Evelyn woke before dawn. A pale gray light filtered through the kitchen windows. She made coffee and spread the latest documents across the table. Again she reviewed Daniel's story. Again she studied the journal. Again she examined the property map Clara had hidden in the attic. And that was when she noticed something she had overlooked. A tiny marking near the northern edge of the cabin clearing, barely visible. Not a circle like the cabin, not a label, just a small hand-drawn X. She stared at it, then leaned closer. The mark sat several yards behind the cabin, near a cluster of trees. At first it seemed insignificant. Then she remembered something. Clara had darkened the cabin circle repeatedly, but she had also drawn this tiny X, deliberately, not accidentally. Evelyn folded the map. A familiar feeling settled over her. The same feeling she had before finding the buried lockbox. The same feeling she had before discovering the hidden compartment. The feeling that another piece of the puzzle was waiting. Outside, Ranger was already standing near the porch steps, watching her, ready. An hour later, they were walking through the pine woods again. The morning air was cool. Sunlight filtered through the branches overhead. The forest floor was covered in brown needles and patches of moss. Everything felt peaceful. Yet, Evelyn's heartbeat gradually quickened. She couldn't explain why. Perhaps because she sensed they were approaching the end, not of the journey, of the mystery. The cabin eventually appeared between the trees. For the first time since arriving in East Texas, neither she nor Ranger paid much attention to it. The building no longer held its secrets. Those had already been uncovered. Instead, Ranger continued moving, past the porch, past the doorway, past the rear foundation where he had found the buried box. The dog followed a path through the trees behind the structure. Evelyn hurried after him. Branches brushed against her jacket. Birds scattered overhead. The woods grew denser. Then Ranger stopped. A few yards ahead stood an enormous cedar tree, older than anything else nearby. Its trunk was thick and twisted. Its roots stretched across the ground like weathered ropes. The German shepherd approached slowly, lowered his head, sniffed, then began pawing at the earth. Evelyn froze. The same behavior, the same focus, the same certainty. Her pulse quickened. Ranger! The dog continued digging. Needles and dirt flew backward. Within seconds, a shallow hole appeared between two large roots. Then his paw struck something solid, a dull thud. He stopped immediately and looked at her. Waiting, Evelyn knelt beside him. Her hands trembled slightly as she brushed away the remaining soil. Wood emerged. Not a box this time, a container, long, rectangular, carefully sealed, protected from moisture, protected from time, protected from discovery. For decades, the realization sent a chill through her. Someone had hidden this deliberately. Someone wanted it found, but only when the time was right. Evelyn carefully lifted the container free. The cedar tree swayed gently overhead. The forest seemed unusually quiet. Even Ranger remained perfectly still, watching. Together, they carried the container back to the farmhouse. The entire walk home felt surreal, as though 75 years of unanswered questions rested in her hands. Back inside, she cleared a space on the kitchen table. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Dust floated lazily through the air. Ranger settled nearby. The container opened more easily than the previous discoveries. Inside lay a bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth and one envelope. Unlike everything else she had found, this envelope looked newer. Not modern, but newer. Its paper remained intact. Its handwriting remained clear. Across the front were 3 words: "To whoever finds this." Evelyn sat down slowly. For a moment she simply stared. Then she opened the envelope. A folded letter rested inside. Signed by Daniel Cross. Her breath caught. For several seconds she couldn't move. The man she had spent weeks chasing through history suddenly felt very close, very real. Carefully she unfolded the pages. The letter was dated only a few years before Daniel's death. His handwriting was steady, thoughtful. The words felt personal, as though he were speaking directly to whoever eventually uncovered the truth. Daniels described the events of 1948. Not dramatically, not angrily, simply. He confirmed what Thomas Harper's journal had suggested. Several families had been deceived out of their land. Records had been manipulated. Property had been transferred through dishonest means. When Daniel discovered the pattern, he tried to expose it. The accusations against him followed soon afterward. He realized he would never receive a fair hearing, so he left, not because he was guilty, because staying would destroy any chance of preserving the evidence. Evelyn read every word carefully. The kitchen seemed to disappear around her. Only Daniel's voice remained. Page after page revealed his thoughts, his regrets, his hopes. Most importantly, the reason the cabin had been sealed. The answer brought tears to Evelyn's eyes. The cabin was never sealed to hide wrongdoing. It was sealed to protect proof. Daniel and Clara knew that powerful people would spend years searching for evidence, destroying records, silencing questions, burying history. The cabin became a safeguard, a place where truth could survive, waiting for someone trustworthy enough to uncover it, waiting for someone willing to finish what others couldn't, waiting for someone like Evelyn. She lowered the letter slowly. Emotion tightened her throat. For several moments, she simply sat there, the room silent except for the ticking clock on the wall. Clara suddenly made sense. Everything about Clara made sense. The inheritance, the hidden note, the map, the instructions. She hadn't been leaving Evelyn a property. She had been leaving her a responsibility, not a burden, a responsibility. A chance to finally complete a story that had remained unfinished for generations. Ranger stood and walked over. He gently rested his head against her arm. The familiar gesture brought her back to the present. Evelyn smiled through tears. "You knew there was more, didn't you?" The dog blinked calmly. Outside, sunlight filled the yard. The old farmhouse seemed brighter than usual. The cedar tree stood motionless in the distance. The cabin remained hidden among the pines, no longer mysterious, no longer threatening. For the first time since arriving in East Texas, Evelyn understood why it had all happened. The cabin was never a prison for secrets. It was a vault, a safeguard, a promise carried across 75 years. And now, finally, the truth was complete. All that remained was to bring it into the light. The weeks that followed moved faster than Evelyn expected. For months, the mystery had lived quietly inside journals, buried boxes, hidden compartments, and forgotten letters. Now it entered the world. Jonah Reeves helped organize the records. Every document was copied, every photograph catalogued, every letter preserved. The evidence Daniel Cross had protected for decades was finally examined by historians, attorneys, county officials, and local families whose names appeared throughout the records. At first, there was disbelief, then questions, then verification. The documents held up. The property records matched. The signatures matched. The timelines matched. One by one, facts replaced rumors. Stories that had existed only as whispers suddenly had proof behind them. For some families, the revelations were painful. For others, they were deeply emotional. People learned things their grandparents had never known. Questions that had lingered for generations finally received answers. Old misunderstandings began to fade. Long-forgotten names returned to public memory. Among them was Daniel Cross, the young ranch hand who had once been remembered only through suspicion and disappearance. Now people knew the fuller story. Not a perfect man, not a legend. Simply a man who saw something wrong and refused to ignore it. The county eventually corrected several historical records. Archived documents were updated. Local historians created permanent files preserving the evidence. The story that had nearly vanished was finally protected, this time in the open. Not hidden, not buried, not sealed away. One afternoon, several months later, Evelyn stood in the courthouse square beside Jonah. A small gathering had formed near a display of historical photographs. Families talked quietly. Children wandered between exhibits. Reporters took notes. The atmosphere felt respectful, peaceful, real. Jonah adjusted his glasses as he studied one of the displays. Clara would have liked this. Evelyn smiled. I think so too. The retired teacher nodded toward a photograph of Daniel. A restored copy. No scratched-out face, no missing identity. Just the young man himself. visible again, remembered again. For a moment neither spoke. Then Jonah looked at her. "You know, when you first walked into the archives, I thought you'd stay a week." Evelyn laughed softly. "So did I." Instead, she had stayed months. Long enough for the property to become something more than an inheritance. Long enough for grief to slowly loosen its grip. Long enough to discover a purpose she never expected. That evening she drove back to the farmhouse. The sun hung low above the fields. Golden light washed across the grass. The familiar pine trees swayed gently in the breeze. Home. The word surprised her, yet it felt accurate. Somewhere along the way, the property had stopped feeling temporary. Ranger greeted her at the porch. Though perhaps greeted wasn't the right word. The German Shepherd had spent the entire day nearby, watching workers finish a new sign near the old cabin. His tail wagged when he saw her. Then he immediately turned toward the woods, as if inviting her to follow. She smiled. One more walk, his ears perked. That was answer enough. Together they followed the familiar path through the pines, the same path they had walked countless times since her arrival, the same path that once filled her with uncertainty. Now it felt different. The forest seemed lighter somehow, the shadows less intimidating, the mystery gone. When the cabin appeared ahead, Evelyn slowed. Workers had carefully stabilized the structure. Nothing flashy, nothing artificial. The goal had been preservation, not restoration. The cabin still looked old, still looked honest, still belonged to the landscape. A small historical marker stood nearby, simple, respectful. It told the story of Daniel Cross, Clara Harper, Thomas Harper, and the families connected to the property. The truth was no longer hidden. It was available to anyone willing to read it. Evelyn stopped near the edge of the clearing, then looked down at Ranger. The German Shepherd stood quietly beside her, relaxed, comfortable. No tension, no hesitation, no fixed stare toward the doorway. Just calm attention, the kind he always carried when everything was finally right. A sudden realization made her smile. "Go ahead." Ranger looked up, then toward the cabin, then back at her. For a second, nothing happened. Then the dog started walking, across the clearing, across the porch, directly toward the front door. Evelyn watched, her breath caught unexpectedly, because this was the first time, the very first time. Since arriving in East Texas, the German Shepherd crossed the porch without stopping, without freezing, without lowering his ears, without turning away. He simply walked forward, as though whatever had troubled him was finally gone, as though the task he had been trying to complete was finished. The sight moved her more than she expected. For a moment she stood frozen. Then she followed. The old porch creaked beneath her boots. Warm sunlight filtered through the trees. Ranger disappeared through the doorway, calmly, confidently. Evelyn stepped inside. The cabin felt different now. Not because the building had changed, because she had. Months earlier, she entered this property carrying grief, loss, loneliness, a future she hadn't planned for. She came intending to sell the land and leave. Instead, she found something she never expected: connection, purpose, a story worth protecting, a reason to keep moving forward. Ranger settled comfortably near one of the windows. Sunlight illuminated the dust motes drifting through the air. Outside, the pine trees whispered softly in the wind. The cabin was quiet, not lonely, just quiet, the good kind, the kind Robert used to enjoy. The thought brought a familiar ache, but not the same ache, not anymore. This time the memory arrived alongside gratitude. Evelyn sat on an old wooden chair, looked around the room, then smiled. For the first time in a very long while, the future didn't feel empty. It felt open. Beyond the doorway, evening sunlight stretched across the porch. Ranger rested peacefully nearby, and the mystery that began with fear ended exactly where it should have, with understanding. Sometimes the greatest burden is not a secret itself, but the silence surrounding it. Truth may sleep for decades, yet it often survives in small acts of loyalty, courage, and remembrance until someone is willing to face it. With understanding. Sometimes the greatest burden is not a secret itself, but the silence surrounding it. Truth may sleep for decades, yet it often survives in small acts of loyalty, courage, and remembrance until someone is willing to face it. Evelyn sat quietly in the old cabin as the last light of day slipped through the trees. Ranger lay near the doorway, the same doorway he wouldn't cross when they first arrived. For months, she thought the cabin was the mystery. Then she thought Daniel was the mystery. In the end, neither was. The mystery was why so many good people had carried the truth alone for so long.
She looked around the room and imagined that are waiting decades for someone she could trust. Thomas writing down what he saw because he were afraid it might be forgotten. Daniel walking away from his own name so the evidence could survive. And brew on of it, a German Shepherd had done the simplest thing of all. He kept stopping, kept looking, kept refusing to walk past something that didn't feel right. A person would have ignored it, explained it away, move on. Ranger never did. Outside, the wind moved gently through the beams. Inside, the cabin no longer felt still. It felt hurt. Evelyn reached down and rested her hand on Ranger's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. The dog opened one eye, thumped his tail once against the floor, and settled back down, as if he only waiting for someone to listen. And it makes you wonder how many Jews in our old lives are still waiting quiet at a doorway we walked past 100 times.